Hello, this is Andrew Steck from Hearing is Healing Christian Counseling. And we're going to talk about how listening to God can be a mental health skill. And we're going to talk about listening to God as a resource or as a mental health skill. And we're going to put that in the context of the biopsychosocial spiritual model of care. So my subtitle here is Christian Mindfulness-Based Listening in the Treatment of Depression, Anxiety, and Trauma. So what are Christian listening skills? What are we talking about here? So with listening, what we're talking about is hearing God's voice, like actually hearing in the Bible, the God of Israel as revealed through the person of Jesus. And we're gonna be listening to the Lord, and we're going to do it for the purpose of having our heart grow in truths that are clearly written in the scriptures. So our main focus is knowing God. It's experiential knowing God. The purpose is less about hearing God for the purpose of like hearing direction about, hey, God, should I do this or should I do that? Not about predicting events. God, who's gonna win the World Series this year in baseball? That's not what we're talking about. It's hearing God's voice, actually hearing Him the same way that Abraham heard God's voice, the way that Moses heard God's voice. The promise of the New Testament is that we get more glory. Corinthians talks about how if the glory that Moses had was fading, how much more the glory that we get in this new covenant. So we are hearing God, we're listening to his voice, but it's for the purpose of having our heart grow in truths and the things that are already like we already know from the Bible. So for example, and one of the main reasons that we would hear God and listen to him is just to have intimacy with him, but to have our love for him grow and to feel loved by him. So it's all about relationship with God. It's one of the ways that he's given us to know him better is listening. So Christian listening skills are held up by other Christian disciplines, such as reading the scriptures and participating in spiritual community, and it never replaces that. Really important here. So we're not talking about listening above disciplines like knowing him through the scriptures or having church that you go to, things like that. It's held up by those things. So more about Christian listening skills. So the Westminster's Catechism, man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. So it's a way of just experiencing him, having more enjoyment of God. Human beings were created to have union and communion with God. This was the state in the Garden of Eden prior to the fall, and Jesus came to restore this communion through his death, burial, and resurrection. So Jesus is the mediator between God and man. It's not that Christian listening skills. So you go do these skills that we're going to talk about, and all of a sudden that's the thing that brings us to connection with God. But Jesus, his life on earth, his death, his burial, his resurrection, he was the mediator, or he is the mediator between God and man. The whole book of Hebrews talks about how he is a priest or a mediator between God and man forever. So we will forever into eternity be experiencing God, and it will always be through Jesus. Jesus is fully God, but when we come to God and we're using listening skills, it's always through the mediator of Jesus Christ. So listening skills are a way to participate in what was already accomplished in Christ. It's our response to God's great desire for intimacy with us. So we're going to combine psychotherapy skills, and we're going to be going through how some other psychotherapy skills they complement, and they're actually can be intertwined with listening skills. But we're really going to be highlighting the work as far as Christian listening of Dr. Carl Lehman, who created the Emmanuel approach. and also Mark and Patty Verkler and their 4 keys to hearing God's voice. And we're also going to be weaving some traditional listening and contemplative prayer approaches into that. So let's talk about the biopsychosocial spiritual model of care. So this is a whole person approach, and it's used in healthcare. So it's really a lens that healthcare or mental health care would use to approach treating people. It also would be like we're going to want to use interventions based off of each one of these. So it looks at biological roots for illness, biological roots for mental health issues. It looks at psychological roots for illness and mental health issues. It looks at the social parts of life. So social factors would be like family system, upbringing, poverty, social supports, community, culture, social circumstances, and discrimination. And then it's also going to look at spiritual factors. So that's what this approach is. And we're going to look at how listening, hearing God's voice, can be used in the treatment of mental health, and how there's biological aspects of this, there's psychological, there's social, there's spiritual. So that's what we're going to be looking at here. And just to define terms a little bit more, so biological factors for mental health issues, like there could be genetic issues, hormones, physiological systems, exercise and diet can play into this. We know that trauma is really a biological factor because there's observable changes in the brain when there is trauma. And then psychological factors might be beliefs, emotions, personality, coping skills, perceptions, behaviors. And then the spiritual would be like God, faith, human spiritual experiences, and spiritual formation. So listening to God can be a resource in all 4 domains of the biopsychosocial spiritual model of mental health care. So let's look at listening as a biological resource. So these approaches, and again, we're going to be weaving in Carl Lehman's work on the manual approach, and then Mark and Patty Verkler's The 4 Keys to Hearing God's Voice, with some contemplative prayer stuff. But in general, it takes the human nervous system into account. So the Verklers talk about how intentionally calming and relaxing your physical body is part of listening. So we're not going to be coming to God and trying to hear his voice from a place of stress and anxiety, but we're actually going to be calming. But part of calming is physically relaxing your body. So that there's the biological piece there. And then Carl Lehman talks about how when we're in a listening position, the relational circuits of our brain are on board. And so the relational circuits of our brain, like you would have those on board when you're in a conversation with someone and you're hearing them and you feel like they're hearing you. And he talks about how that would be the cingulate cortex of the brain. So just the biological piece there. That's a big thing in Carl Lehman's work. So another piece that we'll talk about here in a moment is that further understanding the concepts of physical activation and the window of tolerance will accelerate practical aspects of spiritual listening. And so some of that work also comes out of sensory motor psychotherapy, which talks about how our physical body is part of our symptoms. So we'll look at that in a moment. So listening is also a psychological resource. Listening is a psychological resource. So it changes cognitions and thought patterns. Listening involves having a change in our perspective or thought. This is similar to many established mental health therapies, such as CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy. So if I was having a hard day at work and I come home and I'm just feeling down and I'm having the automatic thoughts go through my head that I'm a loser, and that's what's going through my mind. And I sit down and I listen to what the Lord would have to say to me, and I hear him say, "Hey, Andrew, these things that you're going through, all of them are accomplishing an eternal weight of glory. And I see how hard today's been for you. I see how your computer wouldn't start, and you're not a loser. I love you. I care for you. And so he tells us truth. I'm for you. I'm on your team. You are so valuable to me. So here's the truths that the Lord has given me. That's really a psychological resource because we're changing our mindsets. So, and again, we'll look at that towards the end of our presentation here. Another psychological resource, and this is really big with listening skills, is that visualization is key. It's a key part of listening in these models. So we're actually going to be using visualization, not that we're necessarily like making things up, visualizing them, but God will be speaking through our visual capabilities and capacities. So that just has a lot of parallel to the psychological resources that would be in other therapies. And then the last part about psychological resources is the emotions. So connecting emotionally with the Lord is vital. So having it feel true that you're loved, that you're cared for, and you're seen is what we call attunement. And especially Carl Lehman goes a lot into this, that attunement. So using a time where it felt true that God loved me and cared for me and saw me, I'm going to use that as the resource when I'm listening. So when I'm praying with someone in my office, or when we're using some listening skills and we're bringing that into a therapy context, if they have an experience of the Lord saying, I love you and I care for you, I always pause and I say, so when God says he loves you and he cares for you, how does that feel? And so we're deepening the emotional, the emotions that are happening there. And I'll even have them say, so they say it feels good, it feels true. And I might even say, so where do you feel that in your body? And they'll say, yeah, I kind of feel it right there. So listening has psychological aspects to it, changes our cognitions. There's the visual piece of it, and there's the deepening of emotions. So all those are psychological resources aspects. And then listening is also a social resource. So Mark and Patty Verkler, they talk about how when we are starting to hear and we're starting to listen, one of the things that we want to do is we write things down, is we want to go to people around us and say, hey, here's what I sensed. I'm trying to hear God's voice, and here's what I'm hearing the Lord say to me. And when we do that, we are building the social resources, or we're building social support around us. So we as people, our brains do not do well when we live all by ourselves, or we live as an island unto ourselves. And so there's the social resources, the social checking of what the Lord's speaking to us. And then as we are also hearing God, we're going to be doing that for other people too. So building culture around listening and hearing what God is saying to us, and encouraging, and also helping when things might not be quite on, and having those in our spiritual community speak into those things, all part of growing in listening skills. So another place where social resources are happening when we're using listening is it's talked about how you tell the Emmanuel story. So when God heals us of something, and his voice has brought wholeness and healing, when we tell other people about that, so this is what life was like, God told me this, and now I'm feeling better. So what life was like was I was feeling anxious about my computer kept, turning off at work, and I was having issues with my technology. And I went and I asked the Lord some questions about it, and I heard him, speak truth. And he told me these things that changed my perspective. Yeah. And I was feeling depressed, and I was feeling anxious, and now I'm feeling peace, and I'm feeling hopeful about my next week at work. So we tell other people about that. And that's what helps kind of cement some of that healing. So there's the social aspect of listening. And then there's the most obvious, just the spiritual. So it's the fourth domain of the biopsychosocial spiritual model. And it shouldn't be neglected. And just, knowing how that whole model works is it's looked at as unethical from a mental health point of view if therapists are ignoring client spirituality. So having quality spiritual interventions can be an important part of psychological care. All right, so we're gonna kind of keep going here, and we're gonna look at how trauma really is a biological need for calm. We're going to connect the need for calm in our bodies with listening. But for now, let's talk about how trauma is the biological need for calm. So trauma creates observable changes to the brain, which makes an individual more likely to be depressed or anxious. There's the adverse child event or the ACEs, which is a test that they give adults to talk about how much trauma they've had in childhood. And we know that there's so many things that they learn from this study and from these tests. But one of the things is that higher levels of childhood trauma not only correlates with things like, sickness and, all kinds of issues, physical issues with the body, but it also correlates with higher prevalence of depression and anxiety. So the ACEs score, you could look that up, Google that. There's a whole bunch of just shows us the prevalence of health and mental health issues that come from adverse childhood events. So just knowing that there's this biological need for calm, where when our system feels a lack of calm, it really affects us. So biological changes can be seen in brain scans and can be objectively measured. So one of the things that they will talk about in the trauma world is how you can do a brain scan of someone who's had trauma and then use an evidence-based treatment such as eye movement desensitization reprocessing, or EMDR. And when treatment is done, you can look at the brain scan, and not only does the person report, yes, my trauma symptoms are gone or they're down, I was having flashbacks and nightmares, now I'm not, but also you can observably see it in the brain. So trauma leaves increased cortisol levels, which again, cortisol is that stress hormone, so it affects the body. And you're going to have higher levels of stress, where when treatment is completed, there's going to be less of that. So that cortisol is that constant state of alert. So people feel stuck in emotions of past trauma, especially in a state of increased physical activation. All right, so let's talk about the window of tolerance. And this is related to that state of calm. So this was originally coined by Dr. Dan Siegel, and it describes the optimal zone where people can handle stress and function optimally. So the window of tolerance is the measuring tool that we use to rate when our activation is in this optimal zone. And we're going to look at activation. And some of this comes out of sensory motor psychotherapy, is where I was trained in this. But activation is the energy experienced in the body at any time. Activation is, so if I am, let's say I'm watching right now, it's March as I'm recording this, and it's the college basketball tournaments, and I'm a basketball fan. So if I'm watching basketball and the team that I'm cheering for scores a basket, and there's a minute or two left in the game, without thinking about it, I might go, yes, right? So my arms are moving up, and there's this activation, there's movement in the body, or there's energy in the body. So that could be a positive thing, like excitement, or even joy could have energy that you're feeling in the body, but it also could be things like anxiety or fear. So we can, at any moment, kind of tune into what am I noticing in my body. And everyone's going to have either negative activation that is below a baseline. I'm feeling relaxed. I was just having, I was just at church and there was a worship song that was on, and it was talking about God's peace, and I just feel relaxed. I feel calm. So that's going to be low energy, or it also could be, and it's oftentimes when people are saying that they're depressed or they're like lack of motivation or some of the symptoms with depression, negative. So 0, -1, 2, 3, even 4, 5. So negative activation, negative energy that you're feeling in the body. I might be slumping. I might be, um, so and here is the picture of the window of tolerance, or how we measure it. So we have 0, 1, 2, 3 is the top of that optimal zone. So the optimal zone is in when we are in the window of tolerance. This is when we are the best version of ourselves. But also, you can be in the window of tolerance and have -1, -2, even -3, and that's a great place to be. So that's that social engagement system. So the nerve endings that connect with my ears and with my eyes, and even with my voice and my mouth, those are more online. So if I'm talking to someone, I am going to be able to really hear what they're saying, and I'm going to feel understood because the my eyes are going to be online. The nerve endings go to my eyes, so I'm going to really be seeing that they're listening to me. So we're socially engaged. So in this place, we're going to feel present. So the energy in our bodies and that optimal zone. So we're going to feel present. We're going to be curious. We're going to be having thoughts that feel like they're in flow. Thoughts come easily. We might feel competent. A big one is we're going to feel compassion for the person we're talking to, and also for ourselves, hopefully, in that place. Our body's going to be relaxed. We're going to be able to be emotionally regulated and grounded. We're going to be interested in what that person is saying. So when we get above 3, so I'm feeling, let's say it is anxiety. So I'm just feeling a little anxious and feeling a little stressed. Once I get above 3, the arousal in my nervous system is high enough that I'm out of that optimal place, or that optimal window of tolerance, and I'm not in my social engagement system anymore. And in this place, I might have racing thoughts. Let's move this down here. I might feel anger, chest might be tight. There might be, my palms might be sweaty, pupils might be small, muscles would be tight. A big one is, this is where I'm in fight or flight. So I'm talking to someone, and so let's say I'm talking to a neighbor, and I realize that they're kind of politically in a different place than where I align, and they're kind of aggressive towards me on it. And so I might just want to get out of there. Like I might have that flight response, or I'm going to see them. This is oftentimes what happens is I no longer see them as a person. I see them as a problem, and I might be nodding my head and not saying a lot, but I'm inwardly in that fight mode. So that fight or flight mode takes us, that's where we are when we're hyper aroused. And so we're not in our best version of ourselves for relationship. We see people as threats. We feel triggered, especially if we've had a lot of childhood trauma. We might be a childhood version of ourselves. I feel like that little kid. So my neighbor is saying something aggressive towards me. It's something that I don't believe. And we'll just use the example because we started there with politically. They say something, and I might feel like that scared little kid. I might even inwardly kind of be going fetal position, but I'm having high activation. There's energy in my body. And then there's also hypoarousal. So -1, -2, -3. Once I'm right out of -3, I'm in that hypoaroused place. And here, my thoughts tend to slow down. So sometimes people would talk about after a hard day of work, or maybe even in the middle of work, they start to become hypoaroused, where like they might put a word of, I feel depressed, but from a trauma perspective, or from a sensory motor perspective or from an activation perspective, really what's going on is they're having low activation. So their thoughts are feeling like molasses and they're just feeling slow. They might feel unmotivated. This is a big place of where when we feel shame, we normally drop low into our that hypo-aroused place. Withdrawing, I just don't want to do anything. I want to stay in today, or I just want to go be by myself. Your body might feel numb or paralyzed. Your body might feel heavy. So we talked about the fight or flight. You might be in freeze. So the window of tolerance is going to have, it's going to really help us understand Christian listening skills, and Christian listening skills are going to help us understand some things about the window of tolerance also. They do kind of go back and forth, but let's talk about for a moment, how do I stay in my window of tolerance? So we know that the relational parts of our brain are going to be on board when we are there, but we also know we're going to have less depression when we're in the window of tolerance. And we're going to have less anxiety when we're in the window of tolerance. So there's just so much for just well-being. God created our physical body. And again, a lot of this comes out of Pat Ogden's sensory motor psychotherapy. And so we're bringing some Christian integration to that. But God created not just this ability for us to hear from him, like that's a reality that in Christ we have that. Whether that's from the word or hearing a still small voice, but also just using our physical body to stay in the best version of ourselves without those huge spikes with depression or anxiety is important. So we want to identify and use resources that correlate with the need for hypoactivation. I'm high and I need to go low, so I need hypoactivation, or I'm low and I need to go high, so hyperactivation. So here's a big one of how we can stay in our window of tolerance, or when we are out of the window of tolerance, how we can come back in. And it's just mindfully tracking what I'm feeling in my body to know if I'm in or outside of my window of tolerance. So we talk about when we're triggered. So I know that on the screen, I'm just a small little box, but if you can see that, here's my brain. And when you're triggered, we talk about how the front of our brain, or our frontal cortex, we flip our lid. So my frontal cortex is offline. I don't have access to the best version of me. And when we are mindful, it brings the frontal cortex back online. And we are going to define mindfulness or as present tense, non-judgmental, just noticing. So I'm talking to that neighbor, going back to that example. I'm talking to that neighbor, and he or she, let's say it's he says something to me, and it's aggressive, and I feel like he's laying into me, and it doesn't feel safe. And so I'm realizing I'm coming out of my window of tolerance, and I either want to attack back or I just want to get out of there. I'm in fight or flight. And so one of the things that we can do is mindfully ask, where am I feeling that activation or that anxiety? Where am I feeling that in my body? And I realize, oh, my chest feels really tight. And the more I ask myself questions about, so, and you probably don't want to do this in the middle of the conversation, but as I, finish it up and I walk away, and I'm realizing I'm still in that fight or flight mode, I just notice that and I study, what does that feel like in my body? And so when I focus right there, what else do I notice? Oh, my shoulders are really tight. Or what if I just relax my shoulders? Yep, now my chest is opening up a little bit. It's not quite as tight. And so you just, oh, what else is going on? Yeah, my palms are a little bit sweaty. And so you might think that noticing physically the activation or the anxiety would cause you to be more anxious, with the exception of if you're about to have a panic attack, that would be something a little bit different. But in general, noticing in that from that mindful place, it actually brings that frontal cortex back online, and it helps you become present, and it helps you become relational again. So what are we mindful of? Um, for the context of what we're talking about right now, really just physically. Let's look at that. There's more that we could look at, but for our limited time, we'll talk about noticing physically. So it could be body sensations. Yeah, I just noticed that it feels like my breath when I breathe, it's like it's narrow. It's not as the wind that even that I'm getting into my lungs, there's less of it. What about movement impulses? What do I notice in my body? Yeah, my hands are just kind of pulling back. Um, it could be five senses. What are we noticing in our five senses? And again, that comes from sensory motor psychotherapy. Let's look at Carl Lehman and his ways of bringing the relational circuits back online. So these are going to have implications again to when I want to hear God's voice and I can't, practicing these things. And that's kind of how he'll talk about it. So here's some things that bring our relational brain on board is thankfulness. So deliberately being appreciative of something. And that's actually in his Emmanuel approach that we'll go through. But another one is humor. So recalling humor from the past or watching humorous content is really good for bringing the relational circuits of your brain on. So I work with a lot of trauma as a therapist, and one of the resources that I will work with people and we will just assign for homework is having them have 2 or 3. It's normally like a YouTube video that they find funny, and everyone's sense of humor is so different that it's the important thing is something that you find funny. And so that is really good for when we're in any of those. I'm super low in my window of tolerance, I need to come back, or I'm super high and I need to come down. So using humor, super important. Another one is attunement. So if I have another person who I'm all upset about something and I know that they care about me and they want to listen to me. And so when I talk about what's bothering me, I look at their face and I can see that they care and they see me and they understand. It just helps me. Brings those relational circuits of my brain online. It's why with husbands and wives, it's when we don't fix the other person's problem and we just listen to them and we just see them and we sit with them and we let our emotion. So as a husband, when my wife is upset by something, if I can let her emotions affect me and see her and care for her in the midst of that, it's going to help her brain, and vice versa if I'm feeling like that, and she can use attunement for me. So that's another one. This is the hardest one to find. Hopefully a good therapist will have that, but sometimes it takes training to be able to have attunement, or just someone who really cares for us and is. But even in caring for us, it's you're trying to. It takes a lot of intentionality in trying to use attunement. So the last one that brings the relational circuits online would be calming, and this would be using something like a familiar scripture or calming music, but just intentionally trying to calm down. All right, so past unresolved trauma causes a person to leave the window of tolerance. So triggers in current relationships trick the brain to think that the trauma is currently happening. And that's maybe how some of the listening skills can be used to help us when we know that we're having trauma symptoms. But we're going to go, probably not going to elaborate on that for now. Right. So more ways to resource or come back into the window of tolerance other than using God's voice. And this would be, so we went through Carl Lehman's, which he's a psychiatrist, but he's in the Christian inner healing world. So here's kind of another side of it, which would be maybe like just the therapy world. What are ways that we can use to come back in the window of tolerance? And so grounding skills. So grounding skills would be maybe, well, 2 different ways to do it would be noticing your body, the sensations of your feet. on the floor. And what do you notice? What in your body tells you that my feet are on the floor? And then mindfully tracking like my legs on the chair, my bottom, my back. So feeling that, that's one type of grounding. And then the other one would be like 3 things that are a specific color in the room, 3 things that are blue, 3 physical sensations in my body, 3 things I can hear. So that can be helpful. We went through mindfully tracking what I'm feeling in the body. Deep breathing is helpful. Changing your posture around, using movement can be helpful. So Christian listening skills can be used as a specific tool to help with the window of tolerance. So it helps with reconnecting. It helps with reoccurring issues that cause triggers. So when I talk to God, he gives me perspective to view the situation differently. So every time I take the trash out, this neighbor comes to me. I'm obviously making this up, right? But every time I take the trash out, this neighbor comes to me and he just throws his political views at me and they're aggressive. And I feel myself so triggered. So when I go to the Lord and I listen to him, I talk to him about this, he helps me change my perspective and it doesn't feel the same. Another way is that since calming myself is part of listening to God, listening can be a resource to use when I'm triggered. We may need to use additional resources already with it, but good to know that. And then listening daily is a mindfulness-based activity and may help increase my window of tolerance. So the window of tolerance for some people, they have teeny tiny little window of tolerance. Other people have huge window of tolerance. Though we're still going to measure it, that +3 to -3. Some people, and this is normally because of childhood trauma, and it can be, developmental trauma, which would be like I just didn't get the love I needed as a child. Mom and dad weren't there for me to let me know that I was cared for the way I needed, or I felt bullied, or different developmental things. It doesn't have to be like your nervous system thought that you weren't going to make it. So that would be a big T trauma. A big T trauma is my nervous system thought I was going to die, or sexual assault. Small T traumas are the small little things. I remember the time where I was picked last for the dodgeball team in Fayed. Or I don't remember the time, but it's still there. My nervous system remembers that. So those are the small T traumas. So but since calming myself is part of listening can be a resource when I'm triggered. Oh, that's the wrong one. Sorry. Listening daily is a mindfulness activity and may help increase the window of tolerance. So the more I listen, the more I can have that bigger, wider window of tolerance. All right. So let's go through. Actually, we're going to stop here. We're going to take a break, and then we'll come back. So tune into the next video.